My name is Clara Ashton and I just turned 18. At my birthday party last night, my dad pulled me aside and spoke in a low voice. When this is over, you're going to sign some papers for Uncle Roland. He said, just a formality. I smiled and nodded. Then I walked into the kitchen, opened my laptop, and transferred my entire inheritance from my grandparents into an irrevocable trust just in case. The next morning, my parents and my younger sister found out the truth. The cottage, the savings, the investments, everything was protected behind a legal wall they could not touch. My dad went pale. My uncle, who had already signed a deal to sell property he never owned, called a lawyer. Before I tell you what happened next, hit like and subscribe. Tell me your city and local time below. I always love seeing where people are listening from. Now let me take you back 6 years. The summer I turned 12, my grandfather picked me up in his old truck and drove me to Maplewood Lake. The cottage sat behind tall pine trees beside the water. The porch leaned a little to one side. The screen door never closed right. The whole place smelled like wood smoke, old books, and something sweet I could never name. Grab the other end, Grandpa said while lifting a fence rail. Grabbed it. We spent the morning fixing rotten fence posts. Grandpa never rushed me. He showed me how to press my thumb into the wood to test if it was weak. If the wood gives in, he said, it's done. Inside, Grandma Eleanor had sandwiches and iced tea waiting on the kitchen table Grandpa built himself. That evening, we sat on the porch and watched the lake turn gold. This cottage stays in the family, Grandpa told me quietly. But family isn't always blood, Clara. Family is whoever shows up. 12 years old, I thought he was just being poetic. He wasn't. After that, I spent almost every weekend at Maplewood Lake. Grandpa taught me how to fix leaks and check the roof. Grandma taught me how to organize books by color because it made the room feel warmer. They showed me every part of that cottage like they were handing me pieces of a secret. Back home, things felt different. Our house in Ferndale was fine. Not warm, just fine. My younger sister, Sophie, had the bigger bedroom with lavender walls and expensive furniture. My room still had old carpet from the previous owners. One night at dinner, Dad talked about the cottage. Dad's place is losing value, he said while cutting his steak. We should sell it and reinvest. Mom nodded. Makes sense. Grandpa said the cottage stays in the family, I said. Dad laughed. Not a mean laugh. A dismissive one. You were 12, Clara. He was just being nice. Then the conversation moved on to Sophie's debate trophy. Nobody asked about the science fair I had won 2 weeks earlier. After dinner, I noticed a glossy flyer on the counter. Hartwell Development, lakefront lots, premium prices. Someone had written a phone number on the side. I stared at it for a long moment. Someone was already looking at my grandparents' home and seeing money. 2 years later, Grandpa Edmund died. I was 14. At the funeral, I saw Dad and Uncle Roland standing near the dessert table. Roland had a folder under his arm. We should move on this before probate gets complicated, he whispered. They were talking about the cottage at Grandpa's funeral. I stayed quiet. I was only 14. I had no idea Grandpa had already planned for this exact moment. 2 years passed. Grandma Eleanor got sick in March and died in June. The last time I visited her, she held my hand tightly. The cottage is yours, Clara, she whispered. Don't let them take it. I promise. She squeezed my hand once and closed her eyes. After her funeral, Dad sat at the kitchen table looking relieved. Now we can finally sort out the property, he said. That night I heard him talking to Roland in the garage. Let's get this moving, Dad said. I stood in the hallway holding a glass of water and suddenly I realized something terrible. Grandma's death felt like a loss to me. But to them it felt like an opportunity. I didn't cry that night. I made a decision instead. From ages 16 to 18, the cottage became my quiet rebellion. Every Saturday, I drove to Maplewood Lake in the old Honda I bought with babysitting money. I fixed torn screens. I swept pine needles off the roof. I repaired weather stripping. Home, the language started changing. The cottage stopped being Grandpa's place. Now it was the family property. Roland started visiting more often. Sometimes he brought folders. Sometimes he brought real estate papers. One night I finally spoke up. Grandma wanted me to keep it. Mom gently put down her fork. Your grandma was emotional near the end, she said. This is business. Business. That became their word for everything. By 17, Dad became more direct. When you turn 18, we'll settle this as a family. But the way he said family made my stomach twist. One afternoon at the cottage, I found an envelope hidden behind old quilts. My name was written on the front. Inside was a business card. Margaret Caldwell, attorney at law. Below her name were 4 small words. Ashton Family Trust. My hand shook. Grandma had hidden this for me to find. 3 months before my 18th birthday, Margaret called me. I need to speak with you before your birthday, she said carefully. That Saturday I met her downtown. Her office smelled like coffee and old paper. She opened a folder and looked directly at me. Your grandparents created an irrevocable trust 6 years ago, she said. The cottage, savings, and investments were placed inside it. Total value about $2.4 million. I stared at her. You are the sole beneficiary. The room felt like it tilted. The cottage was transferred into the trust years ago, she continued. Your father and uncle have no legal claim. Why didn't they tell Dad? Margaret paused. Your grandfather told me something very clear. He said his sons would sell the cottage before the funeral flowers wilted. Then she added something worse. Someone has recently been asking questions about the title. After that meeting, I started paying closer attention. One Sunday, Roland came over for dinner. Afterward, he and Dad went into the garage. I stood near the cracked door and listened. I already signed the purchase agreement with Hartwell, Roland said. $480,000. My chest tightened. How do we clean up the title? Ed asked. We file a quick claim deed, Roland replied. Mom and Dad are gone. We're the legal heirs. What about Clara? She's 17. She can't stop anything. Then Roland laughed. We'll give her 55 grand for college. She should be grateful. I stepped away from the door with ice-cold hands. Roland had already promised to sell a cottage he didn't own. That night I texted Margaret. They're accelerating. Her reply came quickly. I expected that. The next Saturday, Margaret explained everything. The moment you turn 18, you legally become the successor beneficiary, she said. Once you sign the paperwork, I'll file a legal notice at the county office first thing in the morning. Nobody will be able to sell the property. What if they try anyway? They'll fail. I looked down at the papers. Should I tell my parents? Margaret slowly removed her glasses. Your grandfather asked me to protect you, not negotiate with them. 9 days before my birthday, Dad announced he was throwing me a party. Big celebration, he said with a smile. You only turn 18 once. Smiled back. But I knew the truth. My dad was planning my birthday. My uncle was planning to steal my cottage. And I was waiting quietly for both of them to walk into a trap my grandparents had built years earlier. 5 days before my birthday, Mom sat beside me on the couch. Now that you're almost 18, she began softly, we should make some family decisions together. Together. That word felt fake. The cottage costs money, she continued. Taxes, repairs, insurance. If we sell it, we can pay debts and help both you and Sophie. Grandma wanted me to keep it. Mom's patience slipped for just a second. Sentiment doesn't pay bills, Clara. Dad walked in at the perfect moment. I already talked to a buyer, he said proudly. What company? Hartwell something. Already knew. I'll think about it, I said. Dad smiled. That's my girl. Later that night, Sophie came into my room. Mom and Dad keep talking about the cottage after they think I'm asleep, she whispered. They sound excited. Is something happening? I tucked the blanket around her feet. Don't worry about it. But she still looked worried. 3 days before my birthday, Uncle Roland stopped me in the driveway. He smiled like a salesman. "The land alone is worth 480 grand, he said. "You say yes, and you walk away with 55,000 cash, and I get the rest." His smile tightened. "You're young, Clara. 55,000 is a lot of money. Whose name is on the deed?" "Your grandparents, but they're gone now." "That's not how ownership works." For 1 second his expression changed. Then he smiled again. "Don't overthink this." As soon as he drove away, he called someone. I knew exactly who. The night before my birthday, I drove to the cottage alone. The lake was dark and silent. I sat on Grandpa's porch chair and opened Margaret's email. All the legal papers were ready. Everything waited for my signature. At midnight, I read every page twice. Then I closed the laptop and listened to the lake. Grandpa once told me patience wasn't weakness. "It's timing," he said. Finally understood. The tears came quietly. Not because I was weak, because I wished things were different. I wished my father cared more about fishing trips than property values. I wished my mother had asked what I wanted. I wished I didn't need legal papers to protect myself from my own family. But wishes do not win legal fights. Documents do. I went home and set my alarm for 11:45 p.m. At midnight I would turn 18. At midnight everything would change. 11:50 p.m. The house was silent. I joined a video call with Margaret. "Ready?" she asked. The clock struck midnight. I signed the acceptance papers. Just like that, I officially became the legal beneficiary of the Ashton Family Trust. Margaret explained the next step. "At 8 a.m., I'll file a legal notice with the county office. Once it's recorded, nobody can sell the property." I looked at the signed page in my hands. "This isn't a trick," Margaret said gently. "This is your grandparents' final gift." Downstairs, my family slept peacefully. They had no idea Uncle Roland's fake paperwork was already worthless. That same night, Roland printed forged documents at his apartment. He called Dad around 11:30. "Everything's ready," he said. "We file tomorrow morning." Dad sounded nervous. "You sure this works?" "Simple transfer between heirs." But it wasn't simple. Roland had already signed a contract with Hartwell Development. If he failed to provide ownership papers, he would owe them $48,000. He bet everything on property he never checked properly. And by morning he was going to learn the truth. My birthday party started at 4 in the afternoon. The living room was full of neighbors, church friends, and relatives. There were balloons and cake and silver decorations. Smiled. Open gifts. But inside my jacket pocket was the paper that changed everything. Dad stood near the cake and raised his glass. "Clara is officially an adult today," he announced proudly. "And our family has exciting plans for the future." He looked directly at me. "Right, Clara." Every face turned toward me. "Thanks, Dad." I said nothing more. Later, Nora Beckett from next door to the cottage quietly pulled me aside. "I saw your uncle at the property last week," she whispered. "He brought 2 men in suits and measured the land. He had already shown the property to buyers, before he even owned it." After the cake was served, Dad stood again. "Our family has struggled financially," he announced loudly. "But Edmund and Eleanor left us something valuable. The cottage at Maplewood Lake." The room became very quiet. "And as a family," he continued, "we've decided to sell it." "We've decided." The words hit me like cold water. Dad smiled at me. "Clara understands this is best for everyone." I slowly set down my fork. "I never agreed to sell the cottage." Dad's smile froze. "She's joking," he laughed nervously. "I'm not joking." Roland stepped forward. "This isn't the time for this." Looked at him calmly. "You're right. The time is 8 a.m. tomorrow morning." Silence filled the room. Nobody understood what I meant, but Roland suddenly looked nervous. Guests started leaving soon after. Once the house emptied, Mom turned toward me angrily. Do you have any idea what your father is going through? She snapped. He could lose this house. And you're being selfish about the cottage. We are a family, she shouted. And if you love this family, you wouldn't need a lawyer. Froze. How do you know about a lawyer? Mom didn't answer. Instead, she admitted Roland had searched through my bag and found Margaret's business card. The room spun. They had gone through my personal things. Before I could speak, Nora stepped into the kitchen. That girl has every right to speak with a lawyer, she said firmly. Mom glared at her. This is family business. Nora didn't back down. Eleanor would want Clara protected. After Nora left, Dad closed the kitchen door. The house suddenly felt small. Here's what's going to happen, Dad said slowly. Tomorrow morning we file the paperwork. Cottage sells. You get $55,000. Out of how much? Nobody answered. And if I refuse? Dad's face hardened. Then you're on your own. No help with college. No living under this roof. The words hurt more than I expected. You're threatening to kick me out. I'm asking you to be part of this family. I stood up. I am part of this family, I said quietly. I'm the part that keeps promises. Then I walked upstairs. That night, I sat on my bed holding the signed trust papers. My grandparents had known exactly what would happen, and they protected me before I even understood why I needed protection. At 8 a.m. the next morning, the county recorder's office opened. Margaret Caldwell was the first person through the door. She handed over the trust documents and filed the legal notice against the cottage property. From that moment forward, anyone checking the title would see the truth. The cottage belonged to the trust, and I was the beneficiary. At 8:14 Margaret called me. It's done, she said. I sat quietly at the kitchen table eating cereal. Dad and Roland came downstairs dressed for business. We'll be back by lunch, Dad said while grabbing his keys. I looked up calmly. Good luck. At 9:05 a.m., Roland handed his quitclaim deed to the county clerk. The clerk typed the property number into her computer. Then she stopped. I can't record this document, she said. Roland blinked. Excuse me. The property is owned by the Ashton Family Irrevocable Trust. It has been for 6 years. Dad stepped forward. That's impossible. The title records are clear, the clerk replied. Then she added the final blow. There's also a legal notice filed this morning. Roland's face drained of color. Dad slowly turned toward him. You said this was simple. I didn't know about the trust. You're a real estate agent, Dad shouted. How did you not check? Margaret sat quietly in the waiting area watching everything happen. She never said a word. She didn't need to. At 9:22 Dad called me. What did you do? He demanded. I accepted what Grandma and Grandpa left me. You went behind our backs with some lawyer. Dad, I said softly. The lawyer has been involved for 6 years. You just never asked. Heavy silence filled the line. This was my parents' property, he whispered. And they chose me to protect it. Another long silence. Not because they didn't love you, I said carefully. Because they didn't trust you with it. Dad hung up. A few minutes later, Hartwell Development called me. Their lawyer sounded frustrated. We have a signed contract from Roland Ashton. He doesn't own the property, I replied. There was a pause. Then the lawyer asked quietly, is the cottage for sale? No, that same afternoon Margaret gave me worse news. The notary stamp on Roland's paperwork appears fake, she said. My stomach dropped. That's illegal, isn't it? Yes. My uncle hadn't just tried to steal the cottage. He had committed a crime. Dad came home around 2 o'clock in the afternoon looking exhausted. Mom had clearly been crying. Dad sat across from me at the table. The bank is after me for $195,000, he admitted quietly. The store is gone. The cottage was supposed to save us. I'm sorry about the business, I said honestly. But the cottage was never yours to sell. Mom stepped forward. Your grandparents weren't thinking clearly near the end. They created the trust 6 years before they died, I replied. Dad slammed his hand on the table. I'll contest the trust. Then Margaret's voice came through my phone speaker. I had already called her. Mr. Ashton, she said calmly, fighting this trust will cost more than the property itself. The trust is airtight. Dad stared at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw something different in his eyes. Not anger. Defeat. 2 hours later, Roland called the house. Hartwell was suing him for damages. His voice shook. They're accusing me of fraud. Dad's answer was cold. Did you commit fraud? I thought we owned it. You're a real estate agent, Roland. You never checked. Silence. Then Roland admitted something terrible. I found a notary stamp. Dad inhaled sharply. And that's forgery. Roland whispered. I need a lawyer. So do I, Dad replied before hanging up. Over the next few weeks, everything fell apart. Hartwell sued Roland. The county opened an investigation into the fake notary stamp. Roland's real estate license was suspended. People in town started talking, not because I spread rumors, because court records are public. Soon everyone knew the story. Edmund Ashton's sons tried to sell his cottage. His granddaughter stopped them. Some people called me brave. Others called me cold. I didn't argue with either side. One afternoon Roland called me. Please, he begged. Ask your lawyer to remove the legal notice. Maybe I can still fix this. The notice stays, I said. Your grandparents would be ashamed of you. I looked at Grandpa's framed photo on my desk. My grandparents are the reason the trust exists, I answered quietly. They chose this. He hung up. Dad eventually stopped fighting. He sold the building supply store at a loss and worked out a payment plan with a bank. Mom went back to work at a pharmacy. The house stayed barely. For 2 weeks, Dad and I barely spoke. The silence inside the house felt heavy. One evening, Sophie called me from a friend's house. I don't understand everything, she said softly. But I'm sorry they hurt you. My throat tightened. Thanks, sophomore. In late April, I drove back to the cottage. The trees beside the lake were blooming. I unlocked the door with the key Grandpa gave me years earlier. The cottage smelled exactly the same. Pine, old books, sun-warmed wood. I walked through every room slowly. The kitchen table Grandpa built. Grandma's colorful bookshelves. The porch where we watched sunsets. Then I found another envelope in the desk drawer. My name was written on the front in Grandpa's handwriting. Inside was a letter. He wrote that he loved his sons, but they never understood the difference between something that has value and something that is valuable. Then came the line that broke me. I chose you because you asked if the roof needed fixing before you ever asked what the place was worth. At the bottom he wrote, take care of it. It took care of you first. I sat on the porch for a long time after reading that. A week later Margaret called again. The legal notice can now be removed, she said. The title is fully secure. And Roland? He settled with Hartwell by taking out a personal loan. The deal is dead. Then she added, one more thing. Your grandparents also created a separate college fund for you. $55,000. With interest, it's now over $63,000. Closed my eyes. $55,000. The same amount Dad and Roland tried to use to buy my silence. My grandparents had already planned everything. Quietly, carefully, with love. That week, I enrolled at Ferndale Community College, Environmental Science, minor in forestry. The cottage was only 20 minutes away. For the first time, I wrote the cottage's address under home address, and it finally felt true. A few days later, I asked Mom and Dad to meet me at a coffee shop. Neutral ground, not the house, not the cottage, somewhere calm. They looked nervous when they arrived. After we sat down, I spoke first. I love both of you, I said quietly. But the cottage is not for sale. Not now. Not ever. Mom opened her mouth to argue. I stopped her gently. You threatened to throw me out. You searched through my bag. You tried to pressure me into giving away something Grandma trusted me to protect. Dad stared into his coffee. Finally he whispered, I don't know how to fix this. You don't have to fix it today, I said. Then I stood up. I'll call you Sunday. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. One Sunday in May, Sophie came to the cottage carrying pizza. We sat on the porch watching the lake. I didn't know about any of it, she said quietly. I know. Was I part of the problem? I looked at my little sister. She hadn't asked for any of this. You were a kid, Sophie. We both were. She looked out at the water. It's beautiful here. Grandma used to say that every time she sat on this porch. Sophie smiled softly. Can I come back sometimes? Anytime. We spent the afternoon talking about school and the dock and the herons standing near the shore. For the first time in a long while, things felt peaceful. Early one morning in June, I sat alone on the porch with a cup of coffee. Mist floated above Maplewood Lake. The trees stood dark against the sunrise. I thought about everything that happened. I didn't win against my family. There's no victory in being hurt by people who were supposed to protect you. But I kept my promise. And for the first time in my life, I stood somewhere that truly belonged to me. Not because I fought harder. Because two people loved me enough to prepare for the future before I even saw the storm coming. My grandparents couldn't stop my father from becoming desperate. They couldn't stop Roland from chasing money. But they could make sure I had solid ground beneath my feet. I looked out at the lake turning blue in the morning light. Grandpa was right. There's a difference between something that has value and something that is valuable. And my family spent years focused on the wrong one. If you're listening to this and you feel like nobody is protecting you, remember something. Sometimes the people who love you prepare for you quietly. Sometimes they build shelter long before the storm arrives. And sometimes all you have to do is keep the promise they trusted you with. That's my story. If it made you feel something, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you in the next story.